Welcome to Trainer HL Talks, a podcast about architecture, planning, and design trends, as well as current events and noteworthy topics in the field. I am your host, Megan Brock, introducing today's topic, Inclusivity in the Practice of Historic Preservation. May is National Preservation Month, and we wanted to tell the full story of some of the special places that we've worked on for underserved communities. Trainer HL provides planning and architectural design services for historic preservation projects, including restoration, rehabilitation, and adaptive reuse. Our preservation specialists are also great storytellers because of the nature of the work that they do. So, to talk more about these stories and their role in our shared history, I am joined today by Trainer HL Historic Preservation Specialists Vance Kelly, Nancy Goldenberg, and Julia Manglitz. Please introduce yourselves and your roles at Trainer HL.
I'm Vance Kelly. I'm a principal within our Historic Preservation Studio.
And I'm Julia Matthias Manglitz. I'm an associate principal and an architect with the Historic Preservation Studio.
And I am Nancy Goldenberg. I am historical architect and architectural historian, also a principal in the Preservation Studio.
Thank you for joining me today, everyone. We wanted to highlight some of the stories in our history told through buildings that are not often heard by others. I wanted to ask you all what the importance of doing this is for you personally and for you professionally and for those communities.
Well, I believe that historic preservation is not about freezing time. It's not about stopping change. It really is about acknowledging and understanding our past so that as we move forward as a society, we move forward in the right direction. And that's really why we do what we do. I believe history does repeat itself. And so it's so important for all stories, even the difficult stories, be told so that we don't forget about what has happened in the past. And we certainly don't want to repeat the worst part of American history. And so I really do believe that as we're working with clients and helping them tell their stories, we need to tell all the stories, not just the ones that make you feel good.
Yeah, and also, so often when you think of historic preservation, or when the layperson thinks of historic preservation, they think of preserving or freezing in time these iconic monuments, whether they're big churches or fancy government buildings. But it's, history and architectural history is a lot more than just these big iconic government buildings. There's as Van said, there's the less told stories in our history that are part of our history and part of our past and part of our present and will continue to be part of our future. So it's important to get that understanding.
One of the very first preservation projects I was involved in was a building that is unremarkable in many ways to a lot of people. And what hit me about that project still hits me every time we work with smaller sites or sites that are part of history that's not as well acknowledged. It's important not just to tell the whole story, but it's important in a way of culturally saying, I see you. It's hard to become something that you don't have a good role model for, and it's hard to see something that you won't acknowledge exists in the landscape. And when we're working on sites that have to do with difficult stories that people don't always want to tell or don't always want to listen to, or we're working with folks who have, been historically underrepresented, it's a way of acknowledging that they are part of our history, our collective history, and that it matters, and that telling their story matters.
Yeah, I agree with Julia. Your history, your story really is important, and there shouldn't be any segment of the population that should ever be marginalized or pushed aside. When I look at America, we're great because we really are a melting pot of people and their cultures. And I would certainly recommend to everybody who's interested in historic preservation that you embrace what you have. preserve what still physically exists so that it's easier for others to understand your story, appreciate your history.
Love it. There's really something about having a place that you can be present in, that you can feel. If you get rid of those places, you're getting rid of the evidence that this happened, right? It can be so easily taken out of a textbook or rewritten, but it's so much more difficult to take a foundation off of the earth. So in that spirit, let's begin to cover some of these projects and stories. First, let's talk about Bing Kong Tong, which is a meeting hall in Isleton, California. Nancy, you led this project, so would you like to share?
Okay. This is a little structure that was built in 1926 in Isleton, California, which is located on the Sacramento River Delta. The town at the time had a large Chinese population, many of whom were working in nearby fruit canning factories. And at the time the Chinese community was not very well integrated into American society. There were things like the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the Chinese who were here in the U.S. created these tongs or community centers to provide them with a sense of community and with services. And so in 1926, they built Bing Kong Tong as one of these tongs or community centers, which offered language, Chinese language schools and community service, social services for the Chinese citizens of Isleton. And the building served that purpose until about 1970, when the Chinese community waned, really, and the building sat vacant for many years. We were approached by a local group, a preservation-minded local group in the early 2000s. That time, I think there was one Chinese American who was involved with the project, but mainly they were just local Isleton citizens who wanted to see something good happen with this building. But the problem was they had no funds. So our first task was to help them with grant writing to get the money that was needed and also figure out what was needed for the project. Because they knew they wanted to restore the building. They wanted to maintain it as a community center and a small history museum, but didn't really know what that would entail. So we worked with the community over a good 20 years to get the funding first and to help them with the project. And we had to phase the project so that it could be afforded in chunks as the money came in. And so the project got a California Preservation Foundation award in 2018. And that was basically for the exterior phase of the project, and the interior phase, which was just completed last year.
So what were some of the renovations that needed to be done? What conditions did you find when you first visited that site?
The building was one of the worst buildings that I've ever seen condition-wise. I've been working in this field for a long time, and this one was really on life support. It was shored on the interior. It was racking. It was leaning over, but it had been shored up on the interior so that it wouldn't completely collapse. It had pigeons living in the attic, and so the ceiling on the second floor had so much bird dung that it was about to collapse. It was really sagging. There were bees living in the walls. There were actually dead pigeons on the second floor. In fact, one of the last times that I went into the building before it was restored, I nearly threw up when I went upstairs. It was just so nasty. It was really horrible. So it was, but on the other hand, the building was right. It had a very prominent location on Main Street in this little town. So it was this real eyesore that, I was only visiting from time to time as an architect, but for the people who lived there day to day, it was very depressing. So, of course, the challenge of the project was that they had this real derelict building, but they had absolutely no money. So I really commend the community for persevering with this, not just demolishing the building, which the decision could have easily gone in that direction given the condition of the building. But it was important to the community to preserve not only the building, but the history that it embodied. And they did that, which was really, really inspiring. And even before the interior was renovated, after we did the seismic upgrade and restored the exterior, it started to have a domino effect on the town, and adjacent nearby buildings started to get fixed up too. So it made a big difference to this little community.
When you worked with the community, like you said, Nancy, for so long to get funding, what were some of those remarks that you heard? Did anything stick with you?
They were, yeah. I mean, at first, the people had really big hearts, but they didn't really have an understanding of what this would entail, which I think if they did, they probably would never have taken on the project. But they were just some really wonderful people. And there was one couple who was leading the charge for a while, and they also were amateur winemakers. So whenever we would come up to do field work, we'd come back with a couple bottles of wine, which was always very nice. And it was good wine too. And initially there was a group they were some fraternal organization, but they were also incredibly involved in the history of the community. And so they were some of the first people that I met. But it's this little town out in the middle of nowhere, and it's a lot different from working with urban dwellers. I would say people seem to have stronger personalities. Eventually, what really helped the project was there was a semi-retired man who had been a developer. He and his wife moved to the community, and he really took on the project. And he was someone with a professional background in getting projects done. So that was the real turning point for Bing Kong Ton and getting it finished.
So how is the community planning to use that building moving forward?
I did communicate with one of the people just a couple weeks ago, and they have the building open. They haven't finished populating the museum part of it yet. They just have some exhibits hanging on the wall, but they do have a lot of artifacts that have been in storage for several years that eventually will go back and become museum exhibits. I also interviewed as part of the project. I actually interviewed a gentleman he was a kid during the heyday of Isleton, and his he used the building when it was the Bing Kong Ton, and so he had some good stories too.
I would love to hear their side of this story. Maybe we can follow up next time. Well, thank you, Nancy, for sharing. That's really incredible that the community stepped up to preserve that history. So kudos to them, and kudos to everyone, really, who benefits from that. So we're going to shift gears a bit and move south from Isleton, California to Socorro, Texas. There in Socorro sits Rio Vista, which is the last remaining Bracero processing center from the World War II era. So Vance and Julia, you were both involved in this project, so I'll let you tell us all about it.
So the Rio Vista Community Center, which is located in Socorro, Texas, has really one of the most unique stories to tell that I've ever been a part of. The story is a little bit difficult to tell because it affected so many lives. While the development started as part of the El Paso County's Poor Farm program, really its unique significance comes from its association with the Bracero labor program that was established during World War II. As you can imagine, Americans were all fighting in the war, and there was a national, I'd call it a labor crisis in the United States. And what that resulted in was the U.S. and Mexican governments got together and they developed a labor agreement. And so that agreement allowed, I think it was between 1942 and 1964, approximately 4.5 million Mexican workers were hired in order to fill the agricultural labor needs that we had in the United States. Rio Vista was one of only 5 of the Bracero processing centers along the Mexican border, and during its peak, I think it was 1,500 men at one time were contracted by the government at Rio Vista, where they were housed and processed and fed while they awaited their assignment on where they would go in the United States. And Rio Vista really is one of the only remaining facilities that is intact that can represent the program and really tell the story. And while this program may seem to be a wonderful opportunity for all involved, how those men were processed, how they were treated, really is part of the story that needs to be shared with everybody. It's a unique facility. It's a 14-acre site. It's located about 10 miles south of the city of El Paso. The city of Socorro does own 15 of the 18 buildings within this historic district. 12 are adobe. Only 5 are currently occupied, and truthfully, most are really in very deteriorated condition. Some are even in danger of partial collapse. So there's a real need for the preservation of the buildings. The city only uses 5. They use it for city administration offices, for community center type activities as well. They have social service programs, elderly programs, GED classes, and some health classes as well. The city, as part of this program, certainly, or as part of this project, I should say, they've really thought long and hard about how it can and should be used. So they're talking about a public library, they're talking about a health clinic, they're talking about classroom facilities, art facilities, Bracero Museum, meeting space, and even a cafe. And so as Trainer HL was brought on to assist, we really needed to understand what kind of repairs were necessary to stabilize the buildings, and then we were given the opportunity to design each building for its new use, for its complete rehab, rehabilitation, and restoration. A project like this has a number of challenges. It's a campus, so not only are we dealing with buildings that require substantial repair, but from a campus perspective, now we have to deal with utilities and infrastructure, and all of that is required to support each of the buildings and their use. Funding is tight. Funding is a struggle, and so the city of Socorro really does have to look at this project as being completed in phases. So how you prioritize that work, which of the buildings you bring online first, all that has to be coordinated and agreed to in a logical way. And so as Trainer HL became involved, we looked at the condition of each of the buildings. We are in the process of developing a master plan. We're completing or preparing a package that will address the immediate stabilization, exterior stabilization, structural stabilization of each of the buildings as a package that can be looked at as priorities, and then a separate package that deals with the rehabilitation of each of these historic buildings.
So for Rio Vista, some of the layers of history that are available on that site are really relevant to a lot of the stories that we are hearing in the news about immigration, particularly across the southern border. The history of most of the southwest of the United States is fairly unique and somewhat different than the stories that you hear on the eastern seaboard. And one of the things that's become evident working there is that there are a lot of families who are cross-border families and have been for generations. And the geopolitical border that we recognize today is really a very young border in the history of human inhabitation of that part of the continent. And I think one of the most interesting illustrations of that, and maybe illustrations of what happens when you use a river as a political borderline, is that if there had not been this grand flood in the 1820s or 40s, the city of Socorro, that land that the Rio Vista sits on would actually be on the Mexican side of the border. And the longer you inhabit this area of Texas, the more of those stories that you hear, and you start to understand that it's not just been a fluid border because of, indigenous presence and Spanish colonial presence, but also just because of Mother Nature. And I think when you start to understand that deeper history, your nuanced understanding of the political tensions that are going on today changes. And this gets back to why I think those are important stories to tell. The community really needs to preserve this history because they understand and value how unique it is. But a lot of places that have this type of history also really struggle with condition problems, money that has never been there to maintain the facilities. And a lot of those facilities were built as inexpensively as possible. While it started off as an asset for El Paso County as a poor farm, it wasn't something they wanted to sink a whole lot of money into, especially not during the Depression. So a lot of the sites that we deal with were built inexpensively at the time and maybe not as high quality as some other places. And they typically suffer more deterioration from lack of maintenance. And they also tend to suffer sometimes more interventions that are sometimes done with the best of intentions, but also not always with the respect that those facilities need or that the building fabric needs. So it presents some unique challenges about what you keep and what you don't keep, because some of those changes and evolutions are also part of the story of the building and the place and the economic realities that have been present and impacted the community and their resources, all of their resources.
Kind of like tree rings, right?
Yes, very much like tree rings.
And it's amazing how something so simple like our geography is determined by Mother Nature. And that's so easily forgotten when we're considering the cultural history of a place. We think about it politically, but there are a lot of basic underlying issues that can be forgotten. So really great point, Julia.
Well, and it's continued to shift. It's been channelized coming through El Paso because the shifting was causing so many problems. And on my last visit to El Paso, I finally went to one of the national monuments that's been closed because of COVID, that is over a long disputed piece of land within El Paso, that really didn't get resolved until President Johnson's administration in the 60s. It was a 120-year long land dispute between Mexico and the United States. And it was all brought on by shifting of the river. Like I said, it's a very long history that I've come to appreciate in a much different way, for listening to the stories, particularly from people whose roots go back way before the United States was a political entity and before Texas was a political entity. It really starts to bring some of the issues into perspective. And in a way, I think most of us who don't live in that area probably don't understand them the way we should, because we lack that nuance in our understanding.
Yeah, I love the fact that there's been an effort to really reach out to the men and the families who went through this program. And so there's really good documentary information out there about this story from the people who actually lived it, experienced it. And I think that is so valuable to be able to collect that while they're still alive.
And as Vance mentioned, there is a great short documentary about the Braceros called Voices from the Border by the University of Texas at El Paso. I will share a link in the show notes. The next story we're sharing today takes us from Texas back over to Southern California, where during the World War II era, Japanese immigrants and citizens were detained in a military-style camp called the Manzanar War Relocation Center. Nancy, would you like to share some more about this project?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. The Manzanar is located in the desert in Southern California's Owens Valley, and it was one of 10 World War II Japanese internment camps. And by July of 1942, it had 10,000 inmates, and they were forced to remain there until November of 1945. But beginning around 1969, there was a grassroots movement started within the Japanese American community to raise awareness about Manzanar, and as well as some of the other internment camps. In 1992, Manzanar became a National Historic Site, and by being a National Historic Site, the NPS became the steward, and our firm was commissioned to reconstruct one of 8 guard towers in the early 2000s, and reconstruction occurred in 2005. So the Japanese American group, these were survivors of the internment and their children. They wanted a physical remnant of the camp. They had a strong desire to reconstruct one of these 8 guard towers as a potent symbol showing the site's presence and also visually evoking wartime events. I mean, it was a challenge because there was only fragmentary information, and to do a reconstruction, you really needed to be accurate. Otherwise, it's false historicism. So that was the biggest challenge, to do an accurate reconstruction with very little information, but it required a forensic approach. There were some fragments of the building that still existed. There were concrete foundation pads on the site. There were some tower fragments that were scattered around, but I guess one of the most important pieces of evidence were these excellent photographs by Toyo Miyataki, who was a professional photographer who was one of the internees, but he actually documented the site. So there were those photographs, and there were also original Army specifications, which were helpful in identifying the materials. So with those bits of information, we were able to do an accurate reconstruction. So this was an important project. It preserves an important story of our history, but it's also one of the less positive ones. And this is one of the stories that we hope to learn from, so that in the future, similar events don't take place.
For our listeners, we'll be adding a link to the show notes of some of the photography taken while the camp was in operation. I really encourage you to study these photographs and just imagine what it would have been like to have your home and family and really your entire life uprooted like this. There is a photo that really stuck out to me, and the caption simply says, "Baby with measles." I'm not sure how much more I really need to say about that, because it's obviously kind of hard to look at and think about, but really the mother's face says it all. Okay. So we have one more story to share today, and this one takes us all the way from California to Kansas. While the main story here is more well-known, not everyone knows where it began at a small church in Topeka, Kansas called St. Mark's AME Church. Vance, take it away.
St. Mark's AME Church is a small building. It's located on the north side of the river in an economically challenged neighborhood in Topeka, Kansas. So the question is, what makes this place and its history so important? And St. Mark's is listed on the National Register of Historic Places for both Criterion A and B, not for its architectural significance, which is why many properties are actually listed. So Criteria A requires that a property must be associated with an event that has made a significant contribution to our broad history. And Criterion B requires that a property be associated with the lives of persons who are significant in our past. And so who was that person? What was the event that makes this little church significant in our history? Well, most people across the United States certainly have heard about, understand the importance of the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. On May 17th of 1954, the Supreme Court determined at that time that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So separate but equal was not constitutional. And the lead plaintiff in that case was Reverend Oliver Brown. And during the time of that court case, he was made a pastor and asked to lead the St. Mark's AME congregation in North Topeka. Therefore, this little church with a small congregation really does help represent an important part of Topeka's role in the African American civil rights struggle in the United States. And of course, this church and the AME church in general in Topeka goes back much, much farther in time than the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education history. It begins with the Exodusters who moved to Kansas after the Civil War. And so looking back through their history, they're still an active congregation. And the church is certainly looking for ways to make sure that its history won't be forgotten and its ministry can continue to thrive and grow. Reverend Shirley Heermans reached out to Trainer HL just to discuss what the impact would be of listing the church on the National Register of Historic Places. What does it mean to be on the register? Are there advantages? Are there disadvantages? And after that discussion, Trainer HL, we volunteered to help them pursue a new grant through a new program through the National Park Service. As part of that grant, we had to first determine whether the building was significant. And so we had to work with the State Historical Society, the State Historic Preservation Office in Topeka. We had to research and write and pull together the history to show that it was even eligible to participate in this program. National Park Service had a program that was called the African American Civil Rights Grant Program. And so we did that. And of course, then along with trying to prepare the application for the grant, you have to understand the condition of the building, what the issues are, what the priorities are, what the costs might be. And then we helped put all of that into the required form and send it off. And lo and behold, this project was selected as one of the first in that first round of grants. And you can imagine a small congregation with not many resources to be able to receive a grant that was going to help them take care of issues that the building certainly had. And so right now we're working with them to finish up the project, and hopefully very shortly they'll be able to move back into their church where the structural issues are resolved, the building will be weather tight, that the historic finishes and features have been restored so that they can continue their ministry at the same time as telling the important story that they have associated with civil rights in America. So it's a pretty incredible story that needs to be told. I don't think a lot of people understand what resources exist in Topeka, Kansas when it comes to civil rights. And this little church is just part of the story.
That's a great point, Vance. Once something really becomes a historical landmark, some of the smaller stories that contribute to its significance can really become lost. It doesn't make them any less significant, but it does make them important to tell.
Yeah, I find it amazing. So, this was Reverend Oliver Brown's church, and he served during the time that they wanted him there, and then they did ask him to move on to a church in Missouri. And after he passed away, though, the family moved back to Topeka. And Linda Brown, who was the child who was denied access to Sumner School, continued to be a member of the church. In fact, she was the pianist or organist for the church up until nearly the time she passed away. So even though we think about history, even back in the 50s and 60s, Linda Brown's associated with this church was up until the 2000s. So it's a pretty incredible long connection that the family had with the church.
And the Brown v. Board was an umbrella. It was Brown v. Board et al. So it wasn't just the Topeka community. It was a collection of similar lawsuits from other areas of the country. Brown wound up at the top because they did them alphabetically. So if there had been an Abernathy, we wouldn't call it Brown v. Board. And I think that's the other thing, is that similar to what Topeka has, all of these other places have structures and stories similar to the ones in Topeka that are probably overlooked in their communities as well.
Yeah, Julia, I was going to add on. I've heard that comment before, where if there had been a last name that started with A, Brown might not have been the lead plaintiff. But when you get in and look at what the NAACP was trying to accomplish, Topeka was unique in that the schools were segregated up until the time of high school, and then they were brought together. That the school system for African Americans was of high quality. It was good schools with really good teachers taught by African American school teachers, and so it's not as if there was a discrepancy or a difference between the quality of building or quality of education. And I think that was the point that they were trying to convey, or they were needing the courts to either confirm or reaffirm whether separate was equal or whether separate was inherently unequal. And I think that's why the Topeka case with the Reverend Oliver Brown and the school system is why it actually was the lead project to be brought forward.
Yeah. When the site first opened, my in-laws came, and my father-in-law had grown up in Washington, D.C. And out of him attending the museum with us tumbled all of these stories from his childhood growing up in a very segregated Washington, D.C. that my husband had never heard, that some of which his wife had never heard him tell, because he was 17, I think, right at the end of World War II. So he was very much an adult at the time that a lot of this was going on. And his family his parents particularly, were very racist. But he had by this time gone to university. I think he probably had his master's degree at this point and had done some work down in South America. So his experience in the world had been much broader than his parents, and his ideas had shifted significantly from where from what he was brought up in. So it was really interesting to suddenly realize that he had some connection to this too.
Yes, go out and see places, view the world through another lens, be open to understanding someone else's reality. So I want to wrap us up with a few questions to this group and for you, the listeners, to consider. What do the stories about our past tell us about our future?
One of the things I've noticed lately is this attempt to cancel history, to erase it, or at least not to tell it. And so by having these physical representations of what happened, you can't really deny that history as easily. So I think that's an important point in preserving this type of building. I'm thinking of Holocaust deniers, because they weren't there, they didn't experience, so maybe this is all made up. But, we have these, in Germany, they've preserved these camps. So it's a lot harder to deny something when you have a physical relic of that.
Well, and I think there's a distinction between acknowledging and celebrating. When we talk about cancel culture, I think a lot of folks will cite all of the monuments that were removed from Richmond, but that was celebrating a particular kind of history. And I do think there's a fine line there, and I think it's open for discussion and different thoughts depending on what your background and your history are. But I think we need to acknowledge all of our history. And I hope that by making sure that people and places whose history have not typically been told and not typically been put in history books, I hope that by trying to shine a light on those, that changes. And I hope that leads to a more inclusive future where we all recognize and respect each other's backgrounds and how we have all contributed to making this country what it is.
And I really do think it's because of that thought why Rio Vista is so important. Because if there are no other sites or locations that can help tell the story, that you can experience the location, it does make it real. And it's really important for us to be able to show people that this is what happened and this is how it worked and this is how people were treated.
Yeah. The more the dialogue can happen, the more our children and our children's children can grow up with an inclusive experience. And it's not just strange to them. They don't really have to adapt. It's just the way the world is. Great thoughts, everyone. So I have one more question, and this is to help our clients when they are trying to preserve a building with historical significance. What is important for them to know going into a project like that?
Well, I'll start. Oftentimes, historic preservation, I think, is seen as a somewhat elite undertaking, and that when you look at the history books or you look at the properties that are being preserved, oftentimes they are the most grand building, most elaborate, large in scale. And I would tell those that are trying to make a decision on whether what they have is important or not, that your history and your story is just as important as any other segment of the population, that you should embrace what you have and be proud of what you have. And in order to tell that story, you do need to have that physical representation of what has occurred in the past. And so don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to be proud of your history and to work towards preserving it so that others can learn from you.
I think maybe one of the most important things for folks to realize, and Nancy kind of touched on this, is that it is a journey and it doesn't happen overnight. There are going to be setbacks, but you have to persevere and work through those and not lose sight of how important giving this to future generations is. You have to look at it as stewardship that you were bequeathed from previous generations and that you owe it in a way to the next generation, and that comes with responsibility to make the best decisions that you can in the time and the space and with the resources that you have, and to find good people to work with and trust them to help guide your decision-making processes, that it's a team effort.
Julia, that's a great point. It's good to remember that, yes, preservation is hard. It can seem daunting when you feel responsible for so much and there are so many details to consider. But living through the actual time period was harder. So we owe it to them to take care of these places so their story isn't lost and, perhaps more importantly, not repeated. Thank you for joining me today, everyone. We've been sharing information about several of the projects and resources mentioned in this episode on our social media all throughout the month, so be sure to check that out and see some images of these amazing buildings and learn more about them. You can also visit the National Trust for Historic Preservation's website, savingplaces.org, for more information about National Preservation Month and some of the nation's influential but lesser-known stories. While it lasts for the month of May, it's something that we have a passion for year-round. See episode notes or visit trainerhl.com to learn more about how we've helped our clients with historic space solutions that fit their unique needs. Until next time, thank you for joining us on this episode of Trainer HL Talks. Trainer HL is a national architecture, planning, and design firm located in the United States. The company holds a firm belief in sharing resources and insights with professionals, clients, and building users to shape the space we use to live and grow as people. For more information, visit trainerhl.com. That's TREANORHL.com.